They called it the Mountain of Silver, but inside that mountain millions vanished. An empire was built from this mountain, but the price was human lives. Watch until the end because the final truth is darker than the legend. Subscribe for dark, forgotten history. Now.
I am rich Potosi, treasure of the world, king of all mountains, and envy of all kings. Those are the words the city stamped onto its own coat of arms in the early 17th century, and by 1611 that inscription was carved into pediments, engraved onto silver coins, embroidered onto ceremonial banners, printed on shipping manifests, and read aloud in Spanish cathedrals as proof that God had personally promised to pour the modern world out of a single mountain in the Andes. Every syllable of that sentence was true. Every syllable was a confession. At 3:47 in the morning, in the year 1545, on the frozen slopes of a mountain 13,400 feet above the plateau, a man built a fire to stay warm, and by morning, he had accidentally uncovered the largest silver deposit in human history, and in doing so, he had signed the death warrant of 8 million people. The mountain was called Cerro Rico, the Rich Hill, and it would become the single most valuable and most lethal piece of real estate on the surface of the earth. This is not a story about a mine. This is a story about how the modern world was paid for in lungs. But before we go inside that mountain, before we follow the men who descended into its darkness and did not come back, we need to understand the world that existed before the Spanish arrived, because that world was not empty and it was not waiting to be saved. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, the four corners of the world, stretched across 6 modern nations, from Ecuador through Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and into Colombia, governing between 10 and 12 million people, with a sophistication that rivaled anything Europe had produced. They built thousands of kilometers of engineered roads across mountain ranges without a single wheel. They carved agricultural terraces into vertical cliff faces. They developed record-keeping systems called quippers, knotted string devices that encoded population data, tax records, military logistics, and historical narrative into a language administrators across the empire could read. And they had a labor system called Mita, a Quechua word meaning turn or season of labor, a rotational obligation where communities sent workers to serve the state for defined periods, and in return, the state fed them, clothed them, housed them, and returned them to their families. It was not slavery. It had boundaries. It had an exit. The Spanish would keep the name and erase every single boundary inside it. The textbooks say the Spanish brought civilization to a savage continent. The textbooks are wrong. The Andean world in 1532 had freeze-dried potato storage, irrigation works that still function today, a public granary network that had not seen a famine in a century, and what the Spanish brought was not civilization, but extraction at industrial scale. The Spanish arrived in force in 1532. Francisco Pizarro and fewer than 200 soldiers armed with horses, steel, smallpox, and a geopolitical intelligence operation that exploited an ongoing Inca civil war, dismantled the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere in approximately 18 months. At Cajamarca on November 16, 1532, Pizarro invited the Emperor Atahualpa into an unarmed diplomatic meeting, ambushed his retinue, killed between 2,000 and 7,000 unarmed Inca nobles in a single afternoon, and took the emperor hostage. Atahualpa offered a ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver, and the Spanish collected every gram of it, garroted him anyway on July 26, 1533, and moved south. By 1535, the colonial capital Lima was founded on the Pacific coast. By 1541, Pizarro himself was dead, assassinated by his own faction, and the viceroyalty was chaos, and into that chaos in 1545, a herder named Diego Hualpa, searching for a lost llama on the slopes of Cerro Rico, near what is now Potosí, Bolivia, built a fire against the freezing Andean night and woke up the next morning to find that the heat had exposed veins of pure silver running through the rock beneath his feet. Word traveled fast. Within months, the Spanish colonial administration understood what they had. Within a year, the city of Potosí was being constructed at the base of the mountain at an altitude of nearly 4,100 meters, one of the highest human settlements on Earth, in a climate so harsh that crops barely grew, where the air held 40% less oxygen than at sea level, where temperatures dropped below freezing most nights of the year, and where none of that mattered because the silver was there and someone had to go get it. By 1550, Potosí had 14,000 inhabitants. By 1570, 60,000. By 1610, 160,000, making it at that exact moment one of the largest cities in the entire world, larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than Madrid itself, with 36 decorated churches, 14 dance schools, gambling houses paved in silver tile, Italian silk merchants, Portuguese slave traders, Flemish jewelers, 700 licensed prostitutes, all of it documented by the city's own chronicler, Bartolomé Arzanz de Ursúa, in a manuscript that runs more than 3,000 pages, all of it built at the top of the world, all of it powered entirely by death. But that was just the beginning. The man who built the machine that would consume those millions of lives was named Francisco de Toledo, and he arrived in Peru in 1569 as the new viceroy, the king's representative, the highest authority in the Spanish colonial Americas, the second son of a minor Castilian noble family from Oropesa, a man who had spent his youth in the household of Philip II, a man who understood paperwork the way a general understands terrain, and by the standards of his time and his class, he was considered an excellent administrator, and he was also the architect of one of the most systematically brutal labor systems ever constructed in human history. Toledo spent 5 years touring the viceroyalty on horseback, observing, calculating, building a blueprint, understanding indigenous population geography, community structure, existing obligations, and numbers. And he was not doing this out of curiosity. He was counting workers. Because Toledo had a problem, and the problem was this: the silver of Potosí was real and extraordinary and world-altering, but extracting it at scale required labor on a scale that could not be purchased or recruited voluntarily, because the work was too dangerous and the conditions were too lethal, and no rational human being would choose to descend into Cerro Rico for a wage, and so choice had to be removed. In 1573, Toledo issued his decree, a document preserved today in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, 16 folios long, written in dense legal Castilian, and the Mita of Potosí was formalized into colonial law. The system worked like this: every indigenous community within a defined radius, eventually stretching across 16 provinces, covering hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, was required to send 1/7 of its adult male population to Potosí every year. These men, called mitayos, were required to serve 1 year of labor in the mines or processing facilities, and in theory they were paid. A small wage was assigned. On paper, this made it legal. On paper, this made it different from slavery. But in practice, the wage was almost always consumed by fees and debts, and costs imposed by Spanish mine owners before a single coin reached a mitayo's hands, and men arrived at Potosí having walked for weeks, sometimes months, from their home communities, carrying their families with them, because the journey was so long and the absence so extended that families had no choice but to come. And then they arrived, and they were assigned to a mine owner, and then they descended into a darkness. Most of them would never fully leave. This is where things get interesting, and also where things get terrible, because the tunnel they were entering was not a mine in any modern sense. There were no ventilation systems, no lighting systems, no safety protocols, no evacuation procedures. There was darkness and rock and the smell of sulfur and wet stone and the accumulated breath of thousands of men working in spaces so narrow they could not stand upright. The tunnels of Cerro Rico were cut by hand, by indigenous workers using iron bars called baritones to crack the rock face, loading the broken ore into costals, leather or cloth bags, and carrying those bags on their backs up wooden ladders to the surface. Those ladders were made from twisted rawhide and wood, and they stretched in some shafts nearly 300 meters straight up. 300 meters in total darkness, carrying 50 kilograms of ore, after days without proper food or sleep, at an altitude where the available oxygen was already 40% less than at sea level. And in 1554, in the silver fields of Pachuca, in what is now Mexico, a civilian metallurgist named Bartolomé de Medina perfected a process called amalgamation that used liquid mercury, azog, to chemically bind with silver ore and separate the metal from the rock. And when the technique was imported to Potosí by the royal officer Pedro Fernández de Velasco in 1572, yields increased by a factor of 10 overnight, and the system had found its accelerant, and it was extraordinarily efficient, and it was extraordinarily lethal, because mercury vapor, when inhaled, attacks the central nervous system with a precision that no weapon of the era could match, accumulating in tissue, crossing the blood-brain barrier, causing tremors and cognitive disintegration and personality collapse and kidney failure and eventually death, but slowly, over months and years, in a progression so gradual that workers often could not identify what was destroying them. Spanish physicians learned to recognize the syndrome. They gave it a name. They called it Azogado, the mercury poisoned, a man who trembled first in the hands, then in the jaw, then in the spine, whose gums blackened and whose teeth fell out, who lost the ability to speak in complete sentences, who lost the ability to control his bladder, who lost the ability to recognize his own children, who died at 30, who was buried in an unmarked pit outside the parish walls. The processing of Potosí's ore required industrial quantities of mercury, supplied primarily from the Huancavelica mine in Peru, another forced labor operation even more immediately lethal than Cerro Rico. They called Huancavelica the mine that kills by night, and Huancavelica fed Potosí and Potosí fed Europe, and the two mines circulated in a closed loop of engineered death that the Spanish crown treated as a single supply chain and managed with the same accounting rigor it applied to wheat. But Potosí had its own killing pace. The standard shift for a mitayo inside Cerro Rico was 6 days. 6 days underground continuous without returning to the surface. During those 6 days, a worker descended before dawn on the first day carrying a week's supply of food, primarily coca leaves and toasted corn, and did not see sunlight again until the 6th evening. The coca leaves were essential, not recreational, not cultural in the way colonizers dismissed, essential in the most literal physiological sense, because coca leaves, when chewed, slowly release alkaloids that suppress hunger and altitude sickness and exhaustion and allow the human body to continue functioning under conditions that would otherwise produce collapse. And the Spanish knew this, and they provided the coca leaves not out of generosity, but because a worker who collapsed before completing his quota was economically inconvenient. The coca leaves were not mercy, they were maintenance. Inside the mountain, the temperature varied wildly. some tunnels cold enough to cause hypothermia, others near geothermal activity hot enough to approach heat stroke, and the air in the deepest tunnels was so thin and so contaminated with dust and sulfur that workers developed what Spanish physicians documented as mal de mina, mine sickness, which we now know as silicosis, a progressive incurable destruction of lung tissue caused by the inhalation of fine rock dust. Combined with altitude effects and mercury vapor exposure and malnutrition and exhaustion, the average life expectancy of an indigenous man after beginning his Mita service was calculated by colonial-era observers themselves as approximately 4 years. 4 years from healthy and strong, and in his 20s to lungs scarred to near non-function, hands destroyed by repeated impact with iron tools and cold rock, nervous system compromised by mercury, body so weakened by inadequate nutrition at altitude that minor infections became fatal. And the Spanish recorded this. Priests wrote about it. Administrators noted it. A Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas, who had spent 50 years in the Americas watching the encomienda system grind down the Caribbean populations, returned to Spain in 1550 and demanded an audience with the king. And at Valladolid, in a courtroom rebuilt twice from his pleadings, he faced the philosopher Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda in a formal debate over whether the indigenous peoples of the Americas were human beings entitled to the same legal protections as Castilian peasants. Las Casas won. The decision was recorded. The decision was filed. The encomienda was theoretically reformed. And then, 23 years later, Toledo signed the Mita Decree and a system more total than the encomienda began. The textbooks say the Spanish reformed colonial labor in 1550. The textbooks are wrong. The reform applied only to encomiendas held by individual conquistadors. It did not apply to Mita labor levied by the crown itself. The crown simply nationalized the cruelty. This is what the record actually shows, and no one stopped it because the silver kept coming. Between 1545 and 1800, Cerro Rico produced approximately 45,000 metric tons of refined silver, and every year mule trains carried bars of stamped silver down from the mountains to the Pacific coast, where ships crossed the Atlantic to Seville, where the Casa de Contratación weighed it, taxed it, the quinto real, the royal fifth. 20% of all precious metals extracted from the Americas and released it into a European banking system run largely by the Fugger family of Augsburg, whose loans to the Spanish crown were denominated, repaid, and defaulted upon in Potosí silver. And the silver did not stay in Spain. Spain was a leaking bucket. The silver flowed north to Antwerp to pay Flemish soldiers, east to Genoa to pay Italian financiers, further east through the Levant to pay for Persian textiles, and most catastrophically for the indigenous miners who never saw a coin of it, across the Pacific on the Manila galleons to the Ming and Qing emperors of China, whose tax system in the late 16th century switched from grain and corvée labor to silver bullion, creating a global demand sink that made Potosí worth more than any quantity of human life. The German banking house of the Fuggers, based in Augsburg, had by 1557 lent the Spanish crown so much silver-denominated debt that when Philip II declared the first of his 4 sovereign bankruptcies in that year, Potosí's production schedule was restructured in a Bavarian counting house before it was communicated to a single mine owner in Bolivia. The silver circulating in Manila was paying for Chinese porcelain, that was paying for Japanese silver, that was flowing back into European markets, a circuit that historian Dennis Flynn would later call the first genuinely global economy. And at the center of that circuit was a mountain where men coughed black and died at 30. The food existed, the silver existed, the boats existed. What did not exist was any mechanism by which a metayo coughing black in a candlelit shaft could reach the conscience of a Habsburg monarch 4 months by ship away. How did no one see this coming? They did. That was the point. The Crown commissioned report after report, inspection after inspection, royal visitor after royal visitor, and every one of them returned to Madrid with the same 2 findings: that the Mita was killing the indigenous population at a catastrophic rate, and that the Crown could not afford to stop. The silver was the budget was the empire was the silver. To stop the Mita was to stop Spain, so the reports were read, the reports were filed, the reports were forgotten. The mountain ate, and there were voices that tried. Father José de Acosta, a Jesuit priest who had spent years in the Andes, wrote detailed accounts of Mita conditions that reached the Spanish crown, describing workers descending into mines with candles attached to their hats as their only light, working in spaces so tight they could not raise their arms above their heads, drilling in air so thick with dust and fumes that candle flames barely stayed lit. The lawyer-engineer Luis Capoche, in his 1585 Relación General del Asiento y Villa Imperial de Potosí, preserved today in the Biblioteca Nacional de España in Madrid, described men climbing leather ladders with bags of ore weighing 57 kilograms, writing that the climb up was steeper than the climb down because rock is heavier than men, writing that the Indians coughed black for the rest of their lives, writing that they died quietly. They sent their reports to Madrid, and Madrid read them, and Madrid did nothing, because by the late 16th century, the Spanish crown's debt obligations to European banking houses were so enormous that interrupting Potosi's production for any reason, including the survival of the people producing it, was financially unthinkable. Now let us go inside. Let us follow one man. We do not know his name because the colonial records do not preserve it. He was a metayo, a conscript, a number in a quota, a unit of production in a system that had no interest in his name. But we can reconstruct him from the registers and parish books. He came from a community in the province of Chucuito, near Lake Titicaca, perhaps 3 weeks' walk from Potosi. He was likely in his late 20s. He had left a wife and 2 children behind in an adobe house with a thatched roof. He had brought with him a small bundle of toasted corn, a folded poncho, a leather pouch of coca leaves, and a carved wooden figure of the Virgin of Copacabana his mother had pressed into his hand when he left. He had survived the journey. He had registered with the colonial administration. He had been assigned to a mine owner. And this is his shift. He begins his descent before the sun rises. The tunnel mouth is framed by rough-cut stone and timber, and candles, tallow, animal fat are distributed 1 per man, the flame small, its light reaching approximately 1 meter in every direction and beyond that absolute darkness. He descends. The tunnel drops steeply, and the ladder, rawhide and wood, wet with condensation, flexes under his weight, and around him the sound of other men descending, the sound of water dripping from the rock ceiling, the sound of the mountain itself settling and contracting in the cold, producing sounds the men describe as the voice of a spirit they call El Tío, the uncle, the entity who controls whether men live or die inside the earth. Small shrines to El Tío exist at regular intervals inside the mine, crude clay figures with horns, offered cigarettes and coca leaves and alcohol, and the Spanish priests condemn this practice, and the Spanish mine owners permit it, because men who believe El Tío can protect them work harder and stay calmer in conditions that should produce panic. This is religion as production optimization. He reaches his working level where the tunnel is approximately 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters high. He cannot stand. He works in a permanent crouch or on his knees, or lying on his side in the narrowest sections, his iron baritone the length of his arm, striking repeatedly to crack away sections of ore-bearing stone, the sound constant and metallic and rhythmic, coming from every direction, above, below, to both sides, the percussion of dozens of other men doing the same thing, their sounds merging into a continuous mechanical heartbeat that is the sound of the mountain being eaten from the inside. He chews coca leaves. The alkaloids suppress the sensation of hunger and soften the edges of the headache altitude and dust have given him and allow his legs to function past the point where function should have ceased, and after several hours, impossible to measure without light or any visual change in his environment, he has accumulated enough ore to fill his costal, the leather bag loaded with broken rock, weighing approximately 45 to 50 kilograms, and he places the strap across his forehead so the weight transfers to his neck, and he turns toward the ladder, and the ascent takes longer than the descent. Every rung must be tested before weight is applied. The rawhide stretches. The wood is old and damp and improperly maintained. Men have fallen. Men fall regularly. The sound of a man falling inside Cerro Rico, the brief cry, the silence, then the muffled impact from somewhere below, is a sound every Mitayo learns to hear without stopping work, because stopping work means missing quota, and missing quota means penalties that fall not just on the individual, but on his entire community, and this was the system's closing mechanism. Collective punishment, community quotas, designed so that every man became his own overseer, his own enforcer, because the social pressure of community responsibility was more reliable than any Spanish guard. He ascends 300 meters. At the surface, the sunlight is physically painful after days in absolute darkness, and workers emerging from shifts are described in colonial accounts as shielding their eyes with both hands and sitting motionless at the tunnel mouth while their vision slowly recalibrates. Some men, after years of repeated shifts, develop permanent light sensitivity. He deposits his ore at the weighing station, where a Spanish administrator records the quantity against his quota. He has 6 hours before he must descend again. He finds a corner of the surface yard and drinks chicha if he has any, and eats what remains of his toasted corn and lies down on the ground. Not in a bed, not in a shelter, but in whatever space is available in the crowded periphery of the processing yards. And before the 6 hours have passed, a bell rings, and he descends again. This is repeated day after day for the duration of the 6-day shift. And when the 6 days end, the mathematics of quota and debt may mean that he cannot leave yet, that he owes additional days, that a fine assessed against him for some minor infraction must be worked off before he is released. Because the system of debt was a trap built into the architecture of every interaction between Mitayo and mine owner. Fees for tools, fees for candles, fees for the coca leaves that kept them functional enough to work, fees in some documented cases for the privilege of sleeping at the surface rather than in a tunnel niche underground. A man could enter Cerro Rico for a 1-year Mita service and leave 4 years later still technically in debt if he left at all. The comfortable lie was about to shatter. The historian David Brading, working from treasury data and parish registers, estimated the total death toll of Potosi's Mita system at approximately 8 million people across its full operational period, and other historians debate the exact number. Some say lower, 3 million, 5 million. Some say the true total accounting for indirect deaths from disrupted communities and starvation and disease acceleration and the collapse of indigenous social structures is higher. But the debate about the exact number is in some ways a distraction from the certainty, which is that millions of people died over generations in a system that was not the result of war or plague or natural disaster, but of administrative choice, of economic calculation, of a decision made by men in offices in Lima and Madrid who knew what was happening inside Cerro Rico and chose repeatedly to continue it because the alternative, a reduction in silver production, was more costly to them than the deaths of people they did not consider fully human. And there was a moment when that calculation almost broke. In 1780, an indigenous nobleman named José Gabriel Condorcanqui, descendant of the last Inca emperor, took the name Tupac Amaru II and raised a rebellion in the Cusco highlands that spread across what is now Peru, Bolivia, and northern Argentina, and one of his central demands, written explicitly into his 1780 proclamation, now preserved in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, was the abolition of the Mita of Potosí. The Spanish took him 8 months later. They brought him to the central plaza of Cusco on May 18, 1781. They forced him to watch his wife, Micaela Bastidas, garroted, and his son executed before his eyes. They cut out his tongue. They tied his limbs to 4 horses, and when the horses were unable to tear him apart, they beheaded him and scattered his body to 4 separate towns as warning. For the first time, the system was afraid. The rebellion had lasted 8 months, had involved between 40 and 80,000 fighters at its peak, had come within weeks of taking the city of La Paz, and had shaken the entire viceregal administration of Peru and Rio de la Plata so badly that Crown correspondence from that period, much of it preserved in the Archivo General de Indias, openly discusses the possibility of losing the Andes. But fear is not abolition. The Mita continued for another 31 years. It was finally abolished on paper in 1812 by the Cortes of Cadiz, the liberal parliament assembled while Napoleon occupied Spain, and it was re-abolished in person in 1825 by Simón Bolívar, who rode into Potosí on October 26 of that year and climbed Cerro Rico on horseback to plant the flag of the new Bolivian Republic on the summit, and who, according to his aide, stood at the peak in silence for a very long time and then asked how many men this mountain had killed. No one could answer. No one ever will. By that point, the colonial era was ending, and within 15 years, Bolivia would exist as an independent nation. But the mountain remained, and by the late 19th century, the silver was largely exhausted. But tin emerged as the new commodity, and a Bolivian magnate named Simón Patiño, born in 1860 to an indigenous mother, bought the central tin claims and became by 1925 one of the 5 wealthiest men in the world, headquartered in a mansion in Paris, dining with Rockefellers and Rothschilds, while the men in his shafts worked conditions only marginally improved from those of 1573. The Bolivian Revolution of 1952 nationalized the mines. The state-run company Comibol took over. Conditions improved, then collapsed, then improved, then collapsed again. And Cerro Rico is still being mined today, not by the Spanish Empire and not under the Mita system, but by independent Bolivian miners called cooperativistas, approximately 15,000 of them, working in conditions that, while no longer systematic, forced labor, remain among the most dangerous on earth, still using candles in some galleries, still chewing coca, still dying. According to the Bolivian Ministry of Health, at an average age of 40. The mountain itself is structurally compromised after 5 centuries of extraction. A large depression, a crater, is visible from the city below, where the internal structure has collapsed. UNESCO placed Cerro Rico on its World Heritage in Danger list in 2014. Engineering surveys have warned since 2011 that the summit may at some point cave inward into the labyrinth beneath it. The city that worships the mountain is waiting for the mountain to swallow the city. There is a phrase in the Spanish-speaking world still used today, though many who use it do not know its origin, vale un Potosí, worth a Potosí. It means worth an immense, almost incomprehensible amount, a compliment, a measure of worth. And the phrase does not mention what Potosí cost. This is how history gets managed, not through erasure exactly, but through selective framing. The glory survives in language, and the mechanism of the glory disappears from everyday consciousness. You keep the superlative. You quietly forget the system that created the value. The economic historian André Gunda Frank argued that the silver of Potosí did not simply enrich Spain, but created the architecture of the modern global economy in ways that cannot be undone. Because the flood of American silver into European financial markets in the 16th century produced the first global inflation event, the price revolution, which restructured European economies and redistributed power from landed aristocracy to merchant classes and created the financial conditions that eventually produced capitalism. And the economist Darren Acemoglu, in his research with James Robinson, spent years examining why some countries are wealthy and others are poor, and concluded that the single strongest predictor of a nation's current poverty is the intensity of extractive colonial institutions it experienced. The stronger the extraction, the deeper the poverty centuries later. The city of Potosí today has a population of approximately 240,000 people, and it is one of the poorest cities in Bolivia, and Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in South America. And South America, despite containing some of the world's most abundant natural resources, silver, gold, copper, oil, lithium, has the highest wealth inequality of any region on Earth. The mountain extracted, the wealth left, the people remained. 500 years later, the consequences of that extraction are still visible in the economic data of every country the Spanish colonial system touched. Which means Potosí is not history. Potosí is an explanation. The archives keep the receipts. The Casa de Contratación in Seville registered every shipment. The treasury books of Potosí, preserved in the Archivo y Biblioteca Nacionales de Bolivia in Sucre, list the names of mining contractors, the weight of bullion, the royal fifth taken in tax. They do not list the names of the dead. They list the silver. They count the silver, they tax the silver, they never count the men. And so we return to where we began. A mountain, a dark tunnel mouth, the smell of sulfur and tallow smoke, a man with a leather bag strapped across his forehead beginning a descent that will last 6 days and may statistically be one of his last. He does not know that the silver he carries will cross an ocean. He does not know it will fund a war he has never heard of, in a country he cannot imagine, for a king who does not know his name. He does not know that 5 centuries later, people will sit in warm, well-lit rooms and watch a documentary about what happened to him, and that the device they watch it on contains minerals extracted from other mountains in other countries, by other people whose names no one is recording. He knows the ladder. He knows the darkness. He knows the weight of the bag. He knows El Tío is watching, and he descends. I am rich Potosí, treasure of the world, king of all mountains, and envy of all kings. The fire is out. The ladder is still there. The mountain is still standing. The men who built its legend are not, and the world that their labor made possible has never once said their names. If you want more buried history, that the textbooks were too polite to print, subscribe, like the video, and tell me in the comments, what would the modern global economy look like today if every silver coin ever minted from Cerro Rico had to carry the name of a single one of the 8 million dead? Choose carefully. The archives keep the receipts. The mountain is still watching.